Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today we're taking a look at the Sabaj A10d. You'll be forgiven if you've never heard of Sabaj before, but it's actually a brand that sits under the same stable as Topping and SMSL and even Loxg, I believe. The A10d that I'm reviewing here is the 2022 version, not to be confused with the previous model that looks quite different. This one retails for about $300, so I was interested to see how it stacked up against similar competition in the all-in-one market. All-in-one meaning that it's a DAC and headphone amp and preamp all together. So let's jump in and find out.
1, 2, 3, 4. Bombs over Baghdad. Really ain't that bad. Little wiretap, yes, yes. Little dodge in the IRS. Little haven from the tax man. Couldn't hurt that bad. Levies go hold up, they don't think it's alright. Throw Nola in a trash can. Got a carrot in a big stick. Doing big things, think I'm amazing. I don't care what the news is saying. That's a bona fide fact, man. I don't ever feel that bad. In fact, you tell me how dumb wrong you're wasting your energy. Here's the same we spurred out in Tennessee.
Fool me once, shame on you.
For your $300, what you get in the Sabaj A10d is what I would consider a bit of a mixed bag. And what I mean by that is there's some things about it that I really like, and then there's a few other things that I'm not so much a fan of. And let me start by giving you a tour of the unit, because a lot of what I mean about that mixed bag is kind of encapsulated in its design. If we start with the front panel, you've got, first of all, these really odd handles. It makes it look kind of like a rack-mounted device, but it's absolutely not a rack-mounted device, and therefore, I think they actually just get in the way. Maybe some of you like it, let me know in the comments what you think of the look of it, but I personally think it's a really strange, kind of quirky for the sake of quirky design, mimicking something that it really isn't. So I'm not a huge fan of that, but I also recognise that it's entirely preferential and some people might love it. Moving on from there, we've got this large white display, which is quite clean. It's not a particularly special display, but it does the job well. Sitting inside the display is a red standby light, which to me looks a bit tacky, it looks a bit cheap, but again, not something I'm going to hugely penalise, just part of the story of this device. Next to the display, we've then got this rotary control knob, which I think has been stolen directly from an SMSL device, and it feels a bit cheap to handle. It's not bad, and it's got a nice notchy feel, so you know you're getting a precise turn, but the feel of interacting with it is a bit cheap and a bit lightweight. Next to the volume control, we've got a 6.3mm and a 4.4mm output, so there is a balanced output on this device, but it's not actually a balanced amplifier. And so what you might be starting to see is it's just a bit of a mixture of some good solid features, and then some also strange decisions where things just feel a bit cheap, maybe not as well thought out, not as well designed. As we turn the device around, the signs of low quality or low cost parts start to disappear. We've got these nice kind of contoured side panels that I really like. And then on the back, we've got a good solid range of inputs and outputs. You've got XLR outs and RCA outs for your DAC/preamp, and they are a true balanced output, so it is a truly balanced DAC, just not a truly balanced headphone amp. I'll talk more about that later, because that doesn't really matter too much. But for those expecting full balanced, this isn't. Moving on from the outputs, we've got a coaxial input, an optical input, and a USB-C, as well as the thread where you can attach a Bluetooth antenna. So the back of it basically reads like a high quality DAC. And this is what I mean about it being a bit of a mixed bag. There are lots of great features, there's a generally good feel to the device, and then there's just those few things that remind you that it's quite a cheap unit. The final thing on the back is an IEC socket, and on the inside is a switch mode power supply. Now, according to Sabaj's marketing, they talk about it as power purification, but in reality, I'm pretty sure it's just a switch mode power supply. So just instead of having a wall wart or an inline brick somewhere between here and the power socket, it's been built in instead. And that's pretty common, and there's nothing at all wrong with that. I just wonder if maybe the A10d is being marketed a bit too heavily when it's really just a solid cheap device. If we put the device back down now and talk about what's going on the inside, things on the inside are pretty good. You've got a pair of Sabre ES9038Q2M chips, which are a really high quality chip from ESS, and that combined with the controller chip built into the device means you can get DSD512 and PCM up to 768 kHz. There's no talk of MQA anywhere if that matters to you, but everything else is a fully spec'd high quality DAC. The Bluetooth is equally high quality using Bluetooth 5.0, which means low latency, and also coming with LDAC and aptX HD. So on paper, there's lots to like about the DAC stage of this. In terms of the amplification stage, it uses the exact same 1612 op amps that are used in most Topping and SMSL devices, and that means we should expect a good sound quality out of the headphone amp. As I mentioned before, it's not a balanced headphone amp, and that doesn't matter too much to me. Having a balanced DAC and a balanced headphone amp really doesn't actually matter, because the way balanced works for a DAC is all about noise rejection, whereas the term balanced for a headphone amp is a little bit misleading, and all it actually means is that you've got distinct positive and negative channels for the left and the right, but it doesn't work in the same way as what's happening in the DAC, and therefore there's no need for it to necessarily carry through. What matters more is the quality of the headphone stage and the amount of power that it can deliver. In other words, does it have enough? And the A10D, regardless of which output you're using, will deliver about 1 watt into 32 ohms, which is generally plenty. It's not as much as some other devices on the market, say the slightly more expensive topping DX5, but it's still plenty for any headphone that you're likely to want to drive with the A10D. This is not a device that you buy to try to drive a pair of Abyss 1266s or a pair of Hypherman Sesfaras. It's a budget all-in-one designed to drive budget to mid-level headphones and IEMs. And so just to make sure I've been clear, whilst you've got the two outputs, it's just for convenience. It means if you've got a headphone terminated with a 4.4mm plug, you can plug it directly in without the need for adapters. But whether you're plugging it into the 4.4 or you're plugging it into the 6.3, you're getting the exact same amplification stage, and in my testing it sounds basically identical. I say basically because there are sometimes very slight differences between the characteristics of the connectors internally and on the headphone cable, and then of course if you're using an adapter, which I had to in order to connect the same exact headphone to both connections, then that can slightly alter the sound too. But taking into account those very minor variations, there's basically no difference between the 6.3 and the 4.4mm output. And so at this point, we've got what's on paper a pretty solid looking DAC and headphone amp with what I consider to be a slightly unorthodox and not entirely appealing design for me, with just a few signs that unfortunately remind you that it's a pretty cheap device. It's not bad, I can't stress enough that it is not bad, it just doesn't feel as quality as say something like the Aune X1S GT that I've reviewed recently, and that I'll compare shortly with the Sabaj A10d. And I'm talking only at this stage in terms of the look and the feel of interaction. The X1S GT looks and feels a much more premium device, whereas the A10d feels a bit cheap. Whether or not that translates to sound, we'll get to shortly. But first, let me run through just a few key features of the A10d that you might want to know about. The first feature to mention is that the A10d offers switchable line out, and what that means is that you need to tell the device whether you're using the line outs on the back to go to say an external headphone amp or loudspeaker power amp, or if you're using the front headphone outputs. That may sound like an obvious feature, but there are some devices that don't include it, and it means that both outputs are working at the same time, and it can be a real hassle if you want to run, say, a pair of active speakers off the back outputs. If you didn't have that switching ability, the active speakers would be running all the time, even when you had your headphones plugged in. So I think it's a good thing that that's included, but it might be worth being aware that it's either the outputs on the back switched on or the outputs on the front. You can't have both running at once if that matters to you. The two other key features worth mentioning are that, as with most DACs using ESS chips, there are 7 different filters to choose from, and as always, they make very subtle changes to the sound in terms of a slight shift in the sense of soundstage space and a tiny change in the amount of attack in the sound. I'm not going to suggest which one is better or worse because it's very much about personal taste and which ones suit your headphones or earphones. But the nice thing is you can flick through them and find the one that you like. The final thing to mention is that there are 2 different gain modes from the Sabaj A10d. You've got low gain, which applies no extra boost to the sound, it just provides the amount of current needed to drive your headphones. Or you've got high gain, which will add an extra 10 dB to make things much, much louder. In my testing, I use mostly low gain, but both will work equally as well. So with all the features, the interesting design decisions, the look and the feel of it out of the way, let's talk about how the A10d sounds. And the easiest way I think I can describe it is that it sounds clean, but not sterile. And that means that it's got a good sense of clarity, articulation, and detail, but it's also still smooth in its delivery. There's no sense of harshness or dryness or edginess, it's just a really nice sounding little unit. The soundstage is mostly left to right, which is what you normally expect from this sort of device, but there is still a slight sense of depth to it. It's not a completely left-right experience where it over-separates the sound, and it produces a nice, coherent sense of soundstage, albeit not a huge one. As I've already mentioned, regardless of which output you're using in terms of the headphone output stage, you're going to get basically the same sound, which is what I've just described. And when I tried the pure DAC output running a set of XLRs into the Burson Soloist GT, what I heard was performance that was pretty similar to what you get from the headphone output. And what that tells us is that the amplifier within the A10d is about at the right level for the DAC in there as well. So we don't have a situation here where we've got a great DAC paired with a mediocre amp, or vice versa. What we've got is a DAC and an amp that are pretty well matched. With the Burst & Soloist GT, I did hear a little bit more detail and resolution coming out, which says that the Burst & Soloist GT is extracting just a tiny bit more of what the DAC's capable of, but because it was such a minor shift, it does tell us that the amplifier in the A10D is good enough for the task with the DAC included. And so to take that a step further, what that means is that you can comfortably buy this and know that you're getting the maximum performance from the DAC via the headphone amp included. You don't need to add an external amp if you don't want to. As always though, a lot of what I'm telling you doesn't mean a great deal out of context. When you're listening to an individual device on its own, you don't really have a reference point to know if it's really good or actually not that great. If it's really bad, you'll probably know because the sound's going to have the life sucked out of it. Something like the Topping EX5 did that for me. But without a comparison, there's really no benchmark to know if it's just an average performing device or a well performing device. And so as usual, I looked for something that's a comparably priced product, and I was lucky enough to still have the Aune X1S GT here. As I've already mentioned, from a design quality point of view, an interaction quality point of view, I definitely prefer the X1S GT. It's head and shoulders above the A10D in terms of its look and feel. One feels quite cheap, the other one feels quite premium. Listening to both though across a wide range of tracks, what I heard was they're two quite different sounding devices. Most of my testing was using the Sendy Peacock headphones, and the track that I made notes on was Coming Back to Life by Pink Floyd. Listening to that track across both devices, what I heard using the Sendy Peacocks was that the X1S GT loses a bit of treble energy and a sense of treble extension when going from the X1S GT. The X1S GT comes across a touch more organic and a bit smoother, and therefore will suit brighter, more treble-focused headphones like, say, a Hi-Fi Aria, for instance. Although that's probably stretching the limits of what either of these devices is capable of driving effectively in terms of quality, not power. But the point being that with a brighter headphone, I do think the X1S GT could be preferable due to its slightly richer and thicker sound, but the A10D for me was probably slightly preferable in its overall tonal balance. It had a good sense of balance all the way from the bass through the treble, and a better sense of articulation and detail because the treble is a bit more present. That also means that the sound from the A10D has a bit more sense of space to it. One of my slight criticisms against the X1S GT is that it is a bit closed in sounding and a bit thick sounding at times. And the A10D does show that quite well by being more spacious, more open and more detailed sounding. Listening to the opening guitar passage in Coming to Life, it definitely sounds more articulate and textured and detailed coming from the A10D, but then when we get to the vocals, the X1S GT brings a wonderful sense of presence and richness to those vocals. So it's not to say that either of these is good or bad, but I think the A10D has the X1S GT beaten when it comes to detail and clarity, whereas the X1S GT is probably a bit more niche in that it's going to suit people that like a bit of richness and fullness in vocals, or for those that have a brighter headphone that needs a bit more body to it. I find that the X1S GT has a bit more fullness in the bass as well, which again is going to suit some people, but as I said before, I think the A10D does have the better overall tonal balance. And so for me, after comparing both devices, I think if you were going to buy just one of these devices and that was the end of your plans, I think the A10D is probably the better choice. The XC1 is the nicer design device, it's nicer to interact with, and it's got a clearer upgrade path because it allows you to do things like add the master clock, it stacks with its very own streaming and multimedia playback device, and so I think that probably helps with the overall value proposition of the X1S GT. But in isolation, I think the A10D being a little bit cheaper and generally sounding better and more versatile across the board, I think the A10D just pips it if it's the only one you're going to buy. If you have a bit more money, I think something like the Topping DX5 is a better choice still, but the A10D is solid if you're happy with some of its quirks. If you don't mind the look and the fact that it's got these handles on it, if you don't mind the slightly cheap feeling volume wheel, then it's a good sounding and solidly featured device. And so whilst I'd stop short of highly recommending it because I don't particularly enjoy interacting with it, I'd also say there's absolutely nothing wrong with it as such, and the sound quality you get is very, very solid for the price. Keep in mind that for similar money you can also get the excellent SH6 and SU6 from SMSL, and there's a few decisions that you probably need to make. But the good news is that regardless of whether you go with something like the SU6 and SH6, or the Topping DX5, or the A10D here, all three are going to give you excellent performance. I'd personally put the A10d at the bottom of those three, purely because it does feel a bit cheap and I really don't like these handles, but that's just my personal preference. And the good news is that if you're just after an all-in-one with great sound and you don't want to spend as much as the topping DX5, the A10d definitely has you covered. And so if you're in the market for one of these, I'll put some links down below where you can click through, check it out for yourself and pick one up if you're interested in. As always, I hope you found this review useful and it's helped you in making your decisions. And if you have found it helpful, I'd love it if you'd hit the like button and the subscribe button if you haven't already. For now though, let me leave you to the music, so happy listening and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.